Welcome to CN Live's daily report on the substantial hearing of Julian Assange on the extradition request by the United States. Today was a long day at Old Bailey in London, and it went a little over time, so we apologize for our late start. There were fireworks in the courtroom again on day two. We saw an attempt by the prosecution, by the US government with their British lawyers, to narrow the focus of the charge against Assange simply to documents that he released that had the names of informants that were not redacted. This brought an outburst from Julian Assange, whose voice was heard, and Consortium News was monitoring directly the courtroom video. We could hear Assange, and he called out nonsense, that was not true, that the prosecution was wrong, that he was being charged for all the documents that he released, dating back to 2010, era about Iraq and Afghanistan. This later was rebutted by the defense attorney, Mark Summers, who read out in the courtroom parts of the indictment. But the day started with testimony from Clive Stafford Smith, who is an American attorney. He was in the courtroom. He's an attorney who has represented various defendants inside Guantanamo Bay. And an extraordinary scene played out there in a British courtroom in a country that's the strongest ally of the United States that there is, Great Britain. And we heard quite detailed discussion of assassination programs, of torture, of rendition, of war crimes committed by the United States. And I think this had to make the American officials in the room, certainly the British prosecution lawyers, and most likely Vanessa Barrett's, a bit uncomfortable. While this was going on, she was seen typing at her computer. Whether she was taking notes or doing something else, of course, is impossible to determine. But she did not seem to be focused on the witness, because again, this was something you don't often hear in a courtroom in a Western country about the crimes that the United States has committed. And these were, of course, based on WikiLeaks documents that this lawyer, Mr. Smith, had used in his defense of his clients in Guantanamo Bay. James Lewis, on cross-examination, he then brought up this issue that the documents that Smith had referred to, outlining all of these crimes that WikiLeaks had produced, had released, were irrelevant. They were irrelevant because Assange was not being charged on those documents. So he should never have brought them up. He was only being charged on the very few documents that were that had the names of unredacted informants in them. This is a theme the U.S. is really pounding on, and those documents were still classified documents. So whether there were only these documents that he's being prosecuted for or not, he's still being prosecuted for classified documents. I see this as a sleight of hand by the United States to try to play both sides of this. On the one hand, they're saying he is not, and in fact, this is James Lewis, the QC for the prosecution, said, and this is a quote, Assange is not being prosecuted for publishing. And this is a way to appeal to those critics of this process, which say that the prosecution of Assange is, of course, a prosecution of journalism, the publication of classified material. Not so, said Lewis. It's only about him revealing the names of these informants. And this is something I've written about and spoken about quite a bit, because in my understanding, there is no statute in the United States law books against revealing the names of informants. There is one about revealing the names of US government agents. Many of our viewers will remember the Valerie Plame case back in the Bush administration. She was a CIA agent whose cover was blown because her husband had written an article, an op-ed in the Times opposing the US invasion of Iraq before it happened. And that is certainly a crime. But revealing names of informants is not a crime about whose statute was mentioned in the indictment of Assange. It's not, every indictment lists at the top of it all the statutes that the defendant is allegedly broken, but there's nothing in there about an informant. But finally, Lewis actually explained what the US means by this. He's saying that the names of informants are defense information that's protected by the Espionage Act. It's a bit of a stretch, but at least I have some understanding now of what the government was thinking. The fact is, though, that on rebuttal by Mark Summers, the defense attorney, Summers got up there and read out the actual indictment, and it's clear that he's being charged with State Department cables, the Iraq, rules of engagement around the collateral murder video, and generally the defense information that is protected that Assange has released. So it's clear that the entire indictment is not just narrowed to those documents about the informants, but about all the classified information that Assange published. And what the U.S. is trying to do again is to show that, hey, they're really concerned about the First Amendment. They're not going after him for publishing that. It's only because he's an ogre and he's a bad guy and he revealed these names, these dangerous names. Now, Lewis, on cross-examination, also brought up this book by David Lee and Luke Harding, two Guardian journalists, about WikiLeaks. And in that book, they published the password to the unredacted archive of the entire archive that WikiLeaks had given to the Guardian. And there was a password to an encrypted file. And this password could be used by governments and could decrypt that, and they would then learn the names of informants. And in fact, it was when that happened and WikiLeaks became aware of that, that they decided they would release the entire archives after it had already been exposed by the Guardian journalists, so that those informants could see their names and go to safety. On top of that, we have statements on video, which I have linked to on Consortium News, that's on our YouTube channel, of Mark Davis, an Australian journalist who was there in the bunker in the Guardian with Julian Assange, with the editors of the Guardian, who were then always on the phone with the New York Times and the Spiegel, the other partners in the release of that material. And Mark Davis says, and he offered himself as a witness for this extradition process. He's not been called yet as a witness, but he's offered to testify that Julian Assange was the only one who was concerned at that time with the names of the informants, and that he did an all-nighter on the Friday before the Sunday night publication to try to redact as many as he could. So that really needs to be put into this court, because this idea that Assange was reckless about the informants is not true. The Guardian was reckless for some reason publishing that password, and yet here we have the U.S. government's British lawyer trying to say that Assange wasn't even being prosecuted for publishing, only for publishing these documents. And I think that is speaks to the public relations nature of this entire U.S. case, which is try to smear Assange again as someone who's a really bad fellow and he endangered people's lives. And in fact, we didn't hear this in the court from Mark Summers, the defense attorney, but we know from Robert Gates that there was no damage done to any informant, that it was only embarrassment to the United States. We also know in the Chelsea Manning trial, I think it was also established that no one was damaged by the leaks that Manning had made to WikiLeaks. In fact, these very documents with names of informants in them. So there's no material evidence that any informant was ever harmed. That's not stopping the U.S. from pursuing that line in this court to try to convince the British government to send Julian Assange to Eastern District of Virginia in Alexandria. So yes, there's also the issue of the dinner that Lewis tried to bring up, that at this dinner in London with the partners, with the Guardian editors and the Spiegel people, that Assange allegedly said, you know, if informants die, doesn't matter, they deserve it. They shouldn't be informants. Now, John Getz was an editor at the Spiegel at the time, who was at that dinner, and he has said publicly that that is not true, that Assange never said that. But that came from this book from David Lee and Luke Harding. And Getz is on the witness list next Wednesday. So we're going to hear from him about what happened at that dinner. And also at one point, Summers tried to ask Smith and redirect examination about the, I'm losing my train of thought here, about Luke Harding, about his fabricated articles. Of course, he didn't say what it was, but I think Summers was referring to, of course, the article that Harding's name was on, which said that front page story in The Guardian, that Paul Manafort, this was during the Russiagate mania, had gone to see Assange 3 times in the Ecuadorian embassy. The Guardian's never retracted that. They've never provided any evidence. There's no video evidence. It's been denied by everybody involved. And I think that's what Summers was referring to. And that got Vanessa Barait's back up a bit, and she cut him off, and she wouldn't let him go further with that line of questioning about the fabrications of Luke Harding. And that at that point, Summers dropped this story and didn't go further and explain what I did earlier about how the Lee and Harding revealed the password. So that could, this is only the second day, so that might definitely come back up again, I think. Now, Summers on redirect read from, yes, I said that already, about he explained clearly that Assange is not being charged only on these documents that have informants' names in them. Now, I have to go to the painful part of today's session, which was in the afternoon, the continuation of testimony of Mark Feldstein, who is a professor of journalism. He was first examined, of course, by the defense. It's a defense witness. And he made some very good points about what is the practice of journalism in terms of encouraging, cajoling, pressing your sources to give you more information, or even to do something that may be illegal to get the information that is necessary to expose government wrongdoing. Robert Perry, who was the founder of Consortium News, wrote an article back in 2010 when this was happening, when the Obama administration was considering prosecuting Assange, that he himself, as an investigative reporter, he was one of the best the U.S. has ever produced with his Iran-Contra revelations, that Bob Perry would often encourage his sources to commit a small crime, i.e. take a government document, and then release that to prevent larger crime from being committed or exposing a crime like a war crime that's been committed. That's exactly what Assange did. And Feldstein was good in explaining that that was absolutely routine journalistic practice, what Assange has done. But it was on the cross-examination where things really went badly for Feldstein. James Lewis for the U.S. side, he's obviously a very skilled prosecutor, but I'm telling you, the mercy rule should have been called at some point. A referee would have ended that fight a long time ago, because Feldstein was on the ropes. He could not respond to questions. He didn't even remember points he had made in the direct examination. It was a cross to forget for the Assange team. He withered. He never explained, for example, that Chelsea Manning, under the Nuremberg principles, was obliged to reveal crimes committed by the United States government. That this is not a crime. That journalists he didn't even go back to his earlier points that journalists do this all the time. And Feldstein was asking him all kinds of legal questions that he had no way to answer. And I think he was just taking advantage of a man who was totally unprepared for this cross-examination, and tried to get points on the record in this court that he'll be using later on that were really painful to watch, because it was just an extraordinary bullying prosecutorial move. And this is what happens in these courts, and Feldstein was not prepared for that. And I think that this was frankly a shame, because it was pretty much a victory for the Assange team. And yes, well, I'm just handed a note here by my producer that Summers did mention briefly that the password was published by Lee in that book, but I don't think he fully exploited that, but I presume that he will later on in this court case. The Feldstein thing did not end soon enough, and it went on, and maybe Vanessa Barait's could have cut it off, because they went over time. On redirect, Summers tried to get out of Feldstein a few other points that were of interest and importance about what he'd said about this being journalism and routine journalism. But Feldstein was kind of shell-shocked at that point and couldn't even respond to the questions from his own side. So this is what happened today, and we've got 3 more weeks of this. But we see where the U.S. government's going. I think that for them to pound this issue of informants being endangered, that seems to be where they're going here, and then trying to protect themselves from the charge that they are violating the First Amendment with this prosecution. In fact, that was a big part of the back and forth, if I could call it that, between Lewis and Feldstein, that in fact the U.S. is not violating the First Amendment because Assange participated in a crime, the crime of hacking by conspiring with Chelsea Manning to hack. And of course, as he did say at one point, Feldstein, to his credit, that journalists conspire, if you use that word, conspire, then journalists conspire with their sources all the time. That is absolutely routine. And he also tried to hammer him, Lewis did, on the issue of whether this was a political prosecution or not, because in his written testimony and in the report that was produced for the court, Feldstein says this was a political prosecution. But Lewis was being disingenuous in narrowing the definition of political to just electoral politics, trying to say that how would this help hurt, why did Trump do this? Did he think it was going to help him in his campaign? And was it directed from the White House? That in Lewis's thinking, it was only this is only a political prosecution if Trump tells the Attorney General, you got to prosecute this guy. And Nixon came up in the direct examination of Feldstein, that Nixon, in fact, on his tapes, we hear him using some colorful languages Nixon did to say to go and prosecute people, and we have to destroy the New York Times and stuff like that. So there's precedent for that. And then FDR, which is interesting, that came up, tried to prosecute a journalist in Chicago, but the grand jury did not return the indictment. And Lewis used that as an example to show that the grand juries are a barrier to a political prosecution. Well, that is just a totally different case, and it doesn't really apply to Julian Assange's case. In my view, politics is more than just electoral politics. It's about policy, about upholding U.S. policy. Their foreign policy is what we're dealing with here. And when Mike Pompeo, and also the reputations of American officials and the United States itself, this is deeply political because it deals with policy and political reputation. And this is what I think was wrong of Lewis to just talk about electoral politics. When you look at Pompeo and the speech he made, or sections from the revelations of WikiLeaks and to destroy an enemy, this is the motivation. And I think that falls under the category of politicization. Also, they could go looking for co-conspirators. But the fact that the grand jury continued was a big issue for Lewis in showing that you cannot say that the Obama administration did not want to prosecute Assange. They did want to prosecute Assange, but they did not. And the reason given by 2 high DOJ officials to the Washington Post, and that became a contentious issue about how much of this Washington Post article Feldstein actually quoted in his report and how much he didn't. Lewis trying to undermine his status as an independent or impartial expert. In fact, he was saying he was not an expert, he was only giving an opinion. So the fact is that the Obama administration did not prosecute. He was trying to say that in the end of the day, that's the proof that they did not want to prosecute, and they couldn't because of the issue of prosecuting other major media for doing the same thing Assange does. I think the first time I saw a smile on Mark Feldstein's face was when Vanessa Barreza said that court is adjourned. He was quite relieved, and it was so was I, to be honest with you, watching that. So tomorrow starts day 3. We may have Daniel Ellsberg as a witness. We may not, but he's on the list, and that should be interesting because Pentagon Papers came up today as well, and Nixon. So we will go back into that. These are the general themes that were dealt with in today's session. And until Feldstein's meltdown, it looked pretty good for Assange because I think they demolished this idea that the only documents Assange is being prosecuted for are the ones that mention the informants, and that issue is going to be key to this substantive hearing over the next couple of weeks. The issue of the informants and what Assange did or did not do about that, and whether that is actually a crime. It's not on its own. It is a protected part of defense information that the Espionage Act protects. But to say that they're not going after him for publishing, well, they're going after him for publishing those documents that had informants' names in them. So they are prosecuting him for publishing. That was key to today's testimony about what journalists do, whether Assange has done that, and whether he's committed a crime or not. So this obviously has not been settled after day 2, and we will see you tomorrow, hopefully at our promised time, 12 noon Eastern, 5 British time, but the court did run over, and we will pick up this tale tomorrow. For CN Live, I'm Joe Loria reporting. No?